What would you do if the person you had shared a bed with for 14 years turned out to be hiding a double life so disturbing it would one day make national headlines? On a bright Tuesday morning in Scottsdale, Arizona, 39-year-old Rachel Alvarez moved quietly around her sun-drenched kitchen. The marble counters gleamed, the stainless steel appliances reflected the golden light that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the room. At first glance, everything about this moment seemed ordinary, almost idyllic. Her 12-year-old daughter, Sophia, sat at the breakfast bar, pencil in hand, working through her math homework before the school bus arrived. Beside her, 9-year-old Mateo ate cereal with the unself-conscious urgency of a boy eager to finish before his favorite morning cartoon ended in the living room. This was the picture of stability, of the American dream layered with the warmth of family values. To friends and neighbors, the Alvarez family represented something to aspire to: success, comfort, harmony. Rachel herself often wondered how she had gotten so lucky. She had immigrated to the United States from Mexico 15 years earlier, a young woman eager for opportunity, carrying little more than determination and hope. When she met Daniel Alvarez, then a rising star in the world of cosmetic surgery, it felt as though her dreams had taken root in solid ground. Daniel was charming, ambitious, and already establishing himself among the best surgeons in Arizona. To their community, theirs was the story of hard work and partnership paying off in the most visible way. Daniel's private clinic, the Alvarez Aesthetic Institute, bore his name in sleek silver lettering above its glass doors. Patients traveled from across the state, sometimes from across the country, to sit in his consultation room. Hollywood actors seeking subtle improvements, wealthy retirees hoping to hold on to youth, and young professionals wanting to feel more confident all trusted him with their appearances. His reputation was impeccable. Inside the waiting area, visitors found fresh orchids, abstract artwork, and soft lighting designed to make anyone look 10 years younger. His bedside manner was equally crafted, gentle, reassuring, with just enough authority to make even the most anxious client believe they were in safe hands. At home, Rachel devoted herself to their family. After Sophia was born, she stepped away from her marketing career, telling herself that creating a warm and stable home was a form of success just as meaningful as any career. She volunteered at school fundraisers, organized cultural events at their local church, and never missed a single recital or soccer game. She was known among parents as dependable, kind, and always willing to help. Together, she and Daniel projected an image of shared purpose, the model family with matching smiles at holiday cards, lavish dinner parties with friends, and carefully planned vacations to coastal resorts. But behind this polished facade, Rachel had begun to notice small details that didn't fit the picture. In the summer of 2023, Daniel's schedule changed in ways she couldn't quite explain. He began arriving home later, often long after dinner had been cleared away. He offered explanations that sounded reasonable: surgeries that ran over time, administrative meetings that couldn't be postponed, consultations with particularly demanding clients. Rachel accepted these answers without pressing further. After all, medicine was demanding. Success came with sacrifices. And Daniel had always seemed devoted, both as a doctor and as a father. The first rail crack appeared on an ordinary Saturday morning. Rachel was pouring orange juice when Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen without thinking, and the caller ID read simply, "Office, urgent." When she asked, in a casual tone, if everything was all right, Daniel's reaction startled her. He snapped, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it, telling her not to worry about things she didn't understand. The anger in his eyes faded as quickly as it appeared, replaced by an apology, by words about stress and difficult cases. He reached across the counter, touched her hand, and promised he hadn't meant to be short. But the moment left a mark. In the weeks that followed, the changes became harder to ignore. Daniel, once relaxed about his devices, began keeping his phone close at all times. He no longer left it charging on the kitchen counter or tossed it carelessly onto the couch. Instead, it stayed in his pocket, buzzing quietly during family movie nights. Rachel noticed him texting with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to any medical matter. When she joked about him having an affair with his phone, his laugh sounded forced, brittle, not at all like the easy chuckle she remembered. The changes were not just about technology. For years, Sunday mornings had been reserved for church, a cornerstone of their family routine. But now Daniel found reasons to miss. He was overseeing renovations at the clinic, supervising new equipment installations, or meeting with contractors. He explained it all in the same calm, professional voice, but something about the way he held himself felt different, more secretive, more guarded, as though he were building a wall between them. Rachel tried to push aside her unease. She told herself this was what long marriages looked like. That phases of distance and tension were natural. That Daniel's ambition was simply entering a more demanding stage. She convinced herself that the best thing she could do was maintain warmth and stability for their children, to keep their routines predictable, to protect them from the stress that seemed to weigh on their father. But late at night, when she lay in bed pretending to sleep, she heard him. Daniel's voice, low and measured, speaking into the phone in his home office. Sometimes in English, sometimes in Spanish, and occasionally in words she couldn't quite recognize. The hushed tones made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the secrecy, it was the deliberate way he carried these conversations, the way his footsteps moved slowly back and forth across the office floor, the way his pauses stretched into silence as though he were listening intently to someone giving him instructions. Rachel told herself she was imagining things. That suspicion was a poison more dangerous than any secret. But as autumn rolled into Arizona, with cooler nights and the promise of holidays ahead, she found herself watching her husband more closely. Across the dinner table, she studied his face, the same strong jawline and warm eyes that had once charmed her completely, and searched for signs of the man she thought she knew. Instead, she saw a stranger. Someone who smiled less often, who guarded his words, who seemed to carry invisible weight. Someone who, little by little, was slipping away from her. What Rachel could not yet know was that the life she had built with Daniel, the life she had defended against doubt and suspicion, was already unraveling. That beneath the wealth, the clinic, the family photographs, and the quiet suburban streets lay a truth so horrific it would one day shake not only her world but the entire community around them. The first crack in the perfect facade had already shown itself, but Rachel Alvarez convinced herself it was just stress, just the natural ebb and flow of a marriage. She had learned long ago that questioning Daniel too much usually ended in dismissive answers, and she hated conflict. But small details, details too persistent to ignore, began to surface, each one carving away at the trust she had built her life upon. It began with Daniel's phone. He was once the type of man who left it behind on counters or tossed it on the couch without a second thought. Now, the device was an extension of his body. If Rachel reached for it, even to hand it to him, his movements were quick, almost defensive. He checked it in the middle of meals, kept it charging beside him at night, and carried it into the bathroom. Texts came at odd hours. Sometimes in the middle of family movie nights, Rachel watched his eyes flicker toward the glowing screen, his fingers tapping rapidly in replies. When she teased him about being married to his phone, his laughter rang hollow, more like a performance than a genuine reaction. By autumn, other changes were harder to dismiss. Daniel's absences grew longer. For the first time in their marriage, he began working Sundays. Their once sacred church mornings, where the family sat together in the same pew, vanished. He explained he needed to supervise renovations at the clinic. Rachel drove past the building one afternoon on her way to pick up Sophia from dance practice. She noticed something odd. The glass windows, once clear and inviting, were now covered in opaque frosted film. And new security cameras had sprouted at every entrance, staring down like watchful eyes. Inside the Alvarez home, the atmosphere shifted. Their bedroom, once a place of intimacy and whispered conversations, became a silent territory. Daniel slipped into bed long after Rachel had fallen asleep and rose before she awoke. Their lives overlapped, but only on the surface. He stopped sharing the details of his day, stopped asking about hers. Their routines diverged like two lines running parallel, close but never touching. Still, Rachel tried to hold things together. She told herself it was just the strain of a growing business, just the price of ambition. Her role, she believed, was to protect stability for her children. She managed household finances, paid tuition fees, and kept track of their investments with meticulous spreadsheets. That's when she stumbled across something she could not explain away. In November 2023, as she balanced the family's checking account, Rachel saw a series of deposits that made her stomach tighten. 3 transfers, each for exactly $47,000. All within the last 6 weeks. The source was listed as AHS Holdings LLC. The name meant nothing to her. When she asked Daniel about it, his answer came too quickly, too polished. He said it was consulting work for a group of international medical tourism companies. Wealthy clients wanted to combine cosmetic procedures with luxury vacations in Arizona, and he was advising them. He spoke with confidence, even enthusiasm, as if proud of the opportunity. Medical tourism was booming, and of course someone of his reputation would be sought out. His words sounded plausible, maybe even impressive. But the way he spoke them, measured, rehearsed, made Rachel's instincts prickle. The changes didn't stop with money. When she visited the clinic for what she told herself would be a routine dermatology appointment, the receptionist hesitated. Finally, the woman explained that Dr. Alvarez was no longer taking routine patients. He was focusing exclusively on specialized international cases. The phrase unsettled her. The waiting area felt different, too. Once warm and welcoming, it now radiated something sterile and guarded. New staff, mostly young women, moved silently through the halls, avoiding eye contact, their footsteps brisk and purposeful, almost military. That evening, when Daniel returned home, Rachel tried to mask her unease. But as she studied his face under the soft glow of the dining room chandelier, she realized something had changed in him. It wasn't only exhaustion. It was distance. A secrecy that clung to him like a shadow. At night, Rachel lay awake listening. She heard the faint hum of his office computer, the low murmur of phone calls that stretched into the early hours. She could not make out every word, but sometimes the tone chilled her. Sharp, transactional, urgent. Once, when she quietly approached the door, she caught fragments of another language, something that wasn't Spanish or English. She stepped away before he could notice. Her heart pounded as she slid back into bed, feigning sleep. It would have been easier to look away. To accept his explanations, however flimsy. To keep pretending their life was still what the world believed it to be. But the evidence mounted, and with it, her fear. By December, Daniel had become a stranger under the same roof. His briefcase, once casually left in the foyer, was now carried everywhere, locked when unattended. His eyes, once warm, had turned cautious, calculating. Rachel began to wonder if she had ever truly known her husband at all. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Daniel rushed out for what he said was an urgent meeting, forgetting his briefcase in his hurry. Rachel's hands trembled as she reached for it, torn between loyalty and suspicion. She had never violated his privacy, never crossed that invisible line. But something inside her told her the truth was buried in the weight of that leather case. When she opened it, the air seemed to vanish from the room. Inside, neatly organized in folders, was evidence that made her blood run cold. Passports with Daniel's photograph but under different names. Bank statements from offshore institutions in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, accounts holding sums far beyond their reported income. And worst of all, medical files. Dozens of them. Each contained photographs of young women from various countries, their faces frozen in clinical snapshots. Notes in Daniel's handwriting filled the margins, using terminology Rachel didn't recognize. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She took out her phone and began snapping pictures of everything, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold steady. By the time she closed the briefcase, her world had already shattered. The man she had loved, trusted, and built her life around was not who she thought he was. The truth was something darker, more terrifying than she could have imagined. Rachel pressed her back against the wall of her living room, the sound of rain pattering against the windows, the folders burned into her memory. Every dinner, every church service, every vacation replayed in her mind with a new, horrifying lens. Her husband wasn't just living a double life. He was operating in shadows so sinister they threatened to consume everything she had fought to protect. And this was only the beginning. The night Rachel opened Daniel's briefcase was the night her life split into two realities, the one she had believed in and the one she now feared was true. She could have pretended she hadn't seen the documents, could have slipped the briefcase back into its usual place and carried on. But once her eyes had scanned those foreign passports and bank records, once she had stared into the clinical photographs of unfamiliar young women, there was no turning back. For days afterward, she carried the weight of that discovery like a stone in her chest. Every glance at Daniel was tainted with suspicion. Every word he spoke sounded like performance. The thought of confronting him terrified her, not only because of what he might admit, but because of what he might deny. If he could hide something this elaborate, this sinister, for years, what else was he capable of hiding? Rachel decided she needed proof beyond the contents of a single briefcase. She needed to know what her husband was really doing at the Alvarez Aesthetic Institute. Her first step was small. Late at night, when Daniel was asleep, she began combing through their shared financial accounts more carefully. The deposits from AHS Holdings were only the beginning. Buried among legitimate expenses, mortgage payments, school tuition, grocery bills, were transfers that led to shell companies, names that appeared in no business registries she could find. Sometimes the transfers were for just a few $1,000s. Other times, for amounts that left her dizzy, $85,000, $112,000. And always, they were meticulously spaced, designed to blend into the background of ordinary transactions. During the day, she began watching the clinic. On the pretense of running errands, she drove past at different hours. What she saw unsettled her. Expensive SUVs parked discreetly in the rear lot. Young women escorted through side entrances, their heads down, their movements hurried. Delivery trucks arriving at odd hours with no signage on their sides. Windows that never revealed what went on inside. One evening, just after sunset, Rachel parked across the street and watched from her car. She saw Daniel himself step outside to meet a man she had never seen before. The man was tall, dressed in a suit despite the heat, his posture stiff and commanding. The two men spoke in hushed tones, their faces obscured by the shadows. When Daniel handed the man a small black case, the stranger nodded once and disappeared into a waiting SUV. The exchange was swift, practiced, and chillingly professional. Rachel's hands shook on the steering wheel as she realized what she had just witnessed. Whatever her husband was involved in, it wasn't limited to cosmetic procedures. Her fear deepened when she attempted to visit the clinic directly. Pretending she wanted to schedule a follow-up appointment for herself, she walked into the lobby one bright morning. But the place she had once known as warm and elegant now felt alien. The receptionist gave her a polite but guarded smile. Behind her, Rachel noticed cameras angled toward every corner. The chairs in the waiting room were new, stripped of the comforting decor that once made patients feel at ease. The atmosphere was sterile, almost militaristic. When she asked if Dr. Alvarez could see her, the receptionist hesitated before explaining that he was no longer handling routine patients. Only international cases, the woman said, her voice flat, as though reciting a line rehearsed too many times. Rachel pressed. She insisted she was his wife. But that only seemed to make the receptionist more uncomfortable. Dr. Alvarez is very busy. He'll contact you, the woman replied, eyes darting toward the hallway where two young staff members lingered, whispering to one another. Rachel walked out of the building with her stomach in knots. She had never felt so unwelcome in a place that bore her family's name. That night, Daniel came home later than usual. He smelled faintly of antiseptic, stronger than the normal traces of a surgeon's workday. His smile was thin, his words clipped. Rachel studied him as he set down his keys, as he poured himself a drink, as he avoided her gaze. She thought of the women in those photographs. The ones filed away in his briefcase. The ones she had seen slipping quietly into the clinic through side doors. She thought of their children asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware that the father they idolized might not be the man they believed him to be. The house felt like a stage. Rachel played her part, serving dinner, asking polite questions, pretending to believe his vague answers. But inside, her mind was racing. She needed more evidence. She needed to understand the scale of what Daniel was doing. And she needed to know how to protect her children if the truth came crashing down. The breaking point came 1 week later. It was a Tuesday night, just after 11. Daniel was still at the clinic. Rachel sat alone at the kitchen table, her laptop open, the glow of the screen painting her face pale. She had accessed their joint email account and found a thread Daniel must have forgotten to hide. The subject line read, "Shipment Arrangements." The language was coded, almost clinical. References to units and transfers, to prep rooms and extended stays. Attached were spreadsheets, dates, initials, and payment records. Rachel's blood ran cold as she scrolled through them. These weren't business documents. They were logistics. Logistics of human lives being moved like inventory. Her chest tightened. The room spun. She could barely breathe. But she forced herself to keep reading, to take screenshots, to gather every piece of evidence she could. She knew now that she wasn't just a wife uncovering an affair or financial misconduct. She was uncovering a crime, something massive, organized, and horrifying. At that moment, a realization struck her: the man she had shared her life with, the father of her children, wasn't just unfaithful or dishonest. He was dangerous. And she was now carrying a truth that could cost her everything if she didn't handle it carefully. Rachel closed the laptop, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. The silence of the house pressed in around her. Somewhere out there, Daniel was living his secret life, orchestrating horrors behind the polished mask of respectability. And she was the only one who knew. The question was, what would she do next? The decision to step inside her husband's clinic at night was not made lightly. Rachel Alvarez had spent weeks wavering between fear and resolve, but each new piece of evidence pushed her closer to a breaking point. The briefcase, the offshore accounts, the coded emails, they all painted a picture too horrific to ignore. Yet Rachel knew that to truly understand what Daniel was hiding, she had to see it with her own eyes. On a Tuesday evening in December, Rachel waited until her children were asleep. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. She slipped Daniel's spare clinic key into her coat pocket, the one he always kept in his desk drawer, and whispered a silent prayer before leaving. Her car's headlights cut through the cool Arizona night as she drove the familiar road to the Alvarez Aesthetic Institute. But the clinic she approached now was not the same welcoming building she had once proudly told friends about. Under the glare of security lights, its frosted windows and steel doors looked more like a fortress than a place of healing. She parked across the street, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Only a single black SUV sat in the otherwise empty lot, its tinted windows reflecting the glow of the overhead lamps. Rachel waited, scanning the shadows, before finally gathering her courage. She crossed the pavement quickly, every step echoing in her mind like a warning. At the rear entrance, she slid the key into the lock. To her relief, it turned smoothly. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of disinfectant, stronger, sharper, almost suffocating compared to what she remembered. The lobby, stripped of flowers and artwork, felt alien. The chairs were lined up in rigid rows, and the dim emergency lighting cast long shadows along the walls. Rachel held a small flashlight, careful to keep the beam low, illuminating only enough to guide her steps. The deeper she moved into the clinic, the stranger it felt. Hallways she had once walked with ease now seemed foreign. Doors that used to lead to consultation rooms were now marked with coded numbers. Security cameras followed her silently, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. She ducked her head, praying that no one was monitoring them in real time. At the end of a corridor, Rachel paused before an unmarked door. Something about it felt different, thicker, reinforced. Her hand trembled as she turned the knob. The door opened onto a stairwell leading downward. A chill spread through her body as she descended, each step creaking in the silence. The air grew colder, the smell of antiseptic mixing with something metallic, something that made her stomach tighten. When she reached the bottom, the hallway ahead was lined with narrow rooms. Through reinforced windows, Rachel saw scenes that made her throat close. Young women, barely out of their teens, lay on narrow beds. Some appeared to be asleep, but their shallow, uneven breathing suggested heavy sedation. The rooms were Spartan, white walls, a sink, a bucket. No windows. No personal belongings. Just confinement. Rachel's breath came in sharp bursts. Her hands gripped the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. She forced herself to keep moving, peering into each room. The silence was worse than screaming. It was the silence of hopelessness, of lives stripped of choice. In the seventh room, Rachel froze. On the bed sat a face she recognized. Isabella, a refugee girl Daniel had once claimed to help years earlier. Rachel remembered her clearly, 18 years old, shy but hopeful, seeking treatment for injuries she had sustained while fleeing violence in her home country. Daniel had told Rachel that Isabella had moved to another city to live with relatives. But here she was, older now, hollow-eyed, trapped in this underground prison. The girl's spirit, once timid but bright, seemed extinguished. Rachel pressed a trembling hand to the glass, fighting back tears. "My God," she whispered, her voice trembling. The truth was undeniable. Daniel hadn't been helping these women. He had been holding them, controlling them, using his clinic as a facade for something monstrous. Forcing herself onward, Rachel entered Daniel's office at the far end of the hallway. A computer sat on the desk, its screen still glowing faintly. With shaking hands, she sat down and moved the mouse. Folders appeared on the desktop, labeled with innocuous names like research, consultations, and accounts. But inside, the files told a story of unimaginable cruelty. There were spreadsheets listing names, ages, countries of origin. Payment records in staggering amounts. Correspondence with international contacts about supply and demand. And most horrifying, photos and videos documenting the women under Daniel's control. Rachel covered her mouth, choking back a sob as she scrolled. Her husband wasn't just complicit. He was orchestrating this operation. Using his medical license and reputation to mask the trafficking of human beings. Every memory of their marriage replayed in Rachel's mind, their wedding day, the birth of their children, vacations, family dinners. Each one now tainted. Every smile, every kind word, every moment of intimacy, all of it stained by the knowledge of who Daniel truly was. Rachel copied as much as she could onto a flash drive she had brought. Each click of the mouse echoed like a gunshot in her ears. She knew she was risking everything by staying here, but leaving without proof wasn't an option. Suddenly, a noise behind her made her spin. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. Rachel's heart nearly stopped. She killed the flashlight and crouched low, her body shaking with adrenaline. The footsteps passed the office door, paused for a moment, then continued down the hall. Rachel waited until silence returned before daring to breathe again. When she finally slipped out of the clinic, her body felt hollow, drained. She sat in her car gripping the steering wheel, staring at the building she had once considered a monument to her husband's success. Now she knew it for what it was, a house of horrors. Rachel drove home in silence, the images burned into her mind. She didn't know what her next step would be. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty, the man she had loved for 14 years was a monster. And now, she carried the burden of exposing him. Rachel Alvarez had spent days in a haze after her midnight infiltration of the clinic. The images refused to leave her mind, the sedated girls, the spreadsheets, the photos of Isabella. Every time she looked at her children, she felt a fresh wave of terror. How could she allow them to keep living under the same roof as a man like Daniel? Yet what frightened her most was not what she had discovered, it was what he might do if he realized she knew. For nearly a week, Rachel played the part of dutiful wife. She prepared meals, drove the kids to school, and nodded politely as Daniel gave vague explanations about late nights and new projects. But inside, she was unraveling. Every smile she forced felt brittle, every word hollow. She could not live in this charade forever. Something had to break. It happened on a Friday evening. The sky outside their Scottsdale home had turned the color of ash, a winter storm rolling in from the desert. Daniel came home later than usual, his shoulders stiff, his eyes darting as if still carrying the weight of the outside world. He poured himself a drink without greeting her, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it in silence. Rachel stood by the kitchen counter, her hands trembling, a folder of printed documents tucked under her arm. She had made her choice. When Daniel finally looked up, Rachel's voice broke the silence. "We need to talk." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he said calmly, too calmly. "What about?" Rachel placed the folder on the counter and slid it toward him. Inside were copies of what she had taken from his office, photos of the women, bank records, coded emails. For the first time in years, Daniel's mask slipped. His eyes flickered, first surprise, then calculation, then something darker. "Where did you get this?" His voice was low, dangerous. Rachel's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand tall. "From your clinic. From your office." "I know, Daniel. I know what you've been doing." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then Daniel let out a long breath, almost a laugh. "You don't understand," he said softly. "You've stumbled into something bigger than you can imagine." "Bigger?" Rachel snapped, her fear transforming into anger. "You're holding women in cages. You've turned your clinic into a prison. Don't you dare tell me I don't understand." Daniel stepped closer, his drink still in his hand. His voice softened, the way it always did when he wanted to convince a nervous patient. "Rachel, listen to me. These organizations, they don't give you choices. They came to me years ago. I couldn't refuse. If I had everything, our family, our home, our life, it would all have disappeared." His words were smooth, rehearsed. But Rachel saw them for what they were, lies dressed in sympathy. She shook her head, her voice rising. "Don't make yourself the victim. You've been doing this willingly. You've profited from it. You've hidden it from me, from everyone. You've lied every single day of our marriage." Daniel's jaw tightened. He set his glass down with a sharp clink, his eyes narrowing. "You need to be careful, Rachel. If you go to the police, if you expose this, they won't just come after me. They'll come after you, too. You think you can carry this evidence without consequences?" Rachel's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. "Then let them come. Because I will not stay silent while you destroy lives." For the first time, Daniel's calm cracked. He reached across the counter, grabbing for the folder. Rachel pulled it back, her hands trembling. The sudden movement turned into a struggle, papers spilling across the marble surface, photos sliding to the floor. Daniel's grip tightened on her wrist. "Stop this," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're putting yourself and the kids in danger." Rachel fought back, her voice breaking with fury. "The danger is you." The words hung in the air like a blade. Daniel froze for just a moment, his eyes searching hers. In that moment, Rachel saw the man she had once loved, the man who had held her hand in church, who had rocked their children to sleep. But that man was gone, buried under layers of deceit and darkness. "You don't want to do this," he said finally, his voice low again, almost pleading. "We can fix it. Quietly. Move the operation somewhere else. Ease the women out slowly. No one has to know. We can keep the family intact." Rachel recoiled, horrified. "You're asking me to help you. To become part of this." Daniel's silence was his answer. Her chest tightened, rage and despair colliding inside her. "Those women are someone's daughters, Daniel. Just like Sophia is mine. And I will not let you do this to them." His eyes hardened. "You're not making that call." The struggle that followed was sudden, violent, and terrifying. Daniel lunged for her phone, his hand gripping her arm so tightly she cried out. Rachel twisted, desperate to break free, her fingers clawing at his sleeve. For a moment, The world blurred into chaos, glass shattering, furniture shifting, their breaths ragged. And then it stopped. Daniel stumbled backward, collapsing onto the floor. His chest rose once, then stilled. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound Rachel had ever heard. She knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face, pressing her fingers to his neck, though she already knew what she wouldn't find. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, the same emptiness she had seen in the sedated women beneath the clinic. Rachel sat frozen on the floor, surrounded by scattered evidence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her like a physical force. She wasn't just a wife who had uncovered her husband's crimes. She was now the woman who had ended his life. And though part of her wanted to believe she had done it in self-defense, another part whispered the truth: nothing would ever erase the blood that now stained her hands. For 2 long minutes after Daniel collapsed, Rachel Alvarez sat frozen on the cold tile floor of their kitchen. The world had narrowed to the sound of her own ragged breathing, the scattered documents, and the lifeless eyes of the man she had once trusted with everything. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She pressed her palms against her face, fighting the urge to scream. The truth settled slowly, like dust after an explosion. Daniel was gone. The man who had charmed her at their wedding, who had held their newborns in his arms, who had hidden horrors beneath his surgical mask, was lying dead at her feet. And she had been the one to end it. Rachel's instinct was to cover it up, to protect her children from the storm that was sure to come. A dozen desperate ideas flickered through her mind. She could claim it was an accident. Stage a burglary. Say he had slipped and hit his head. But as her gaze swept across the documents scattered across the counter, passports, bank statements, photographs of terrified young women, she realized hiding the truth would make her no better than him. Her children deserved better. The victims deserved better. With trembling fingers, Rachel picked up her phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, her voice calm, steady, grounding. Rachel's words came in gasps, broken fragments: my husband, dead, his clinic, women being held, you have to help them. At first the operator seemed confused, the mix of domestic violence and human trafficking too bizarre to process. But Rachel's urgency cut through, and within minutes, patrol cars and paramedics were dispatched to both the Alvarez residence and the clinic. When the first officers arrived, they found Rachel sitting at the kitchen table, still in her blood-stained clothes, her eyes hollow with shock. Papers were spread before her like exhibits in a trial. She had organized them while waiting, her mind grasping for order amid chaos. "It's all here," she whispered as they entered. "Everything you need." The scene at the clinic was worse than any of them had expected. Officers forced open the reinforced doors in the basement, finding rows of sedated women. Some were barely conscious. Others cried weakly, too dehydrated or malnourished to speak. Isabella, the young refugee Rachel had recognized, was among them. She was rushed to a nearby hospital, her condition critical but stable. Back at the house, detectives worked through the night. Rachel gave a detailed statement, recounting everything she had discovered: the briefcase, the accounts, the surveillance, the coded emails. Her voice trembled, but she spoke with a clarity that came from weeks of silent observation. Every detail mattered now. She knew that. By dawn, the Alvarez home was surrounded by flashing lights. News helicopters circled overhead. Neighbors gathered at the end of the street, whispering, pointing, their disbelief mirrored in the glow of their phone screens. The story spread quickly: a respected surgeon, dead in his own kitchen, his wife, drenched in blood, a clinic turned into a prison. Within 24 hours, the headlines were everywhere. "Doctor of Death," one paper screamed. "House of Horrors in Scottsdale," said another. National networks replayed aerial footage of the Alvarez home, juxtaposed with smiling family portraits pulled from social media. Commentators debated how such darkness could hide behind manicured lawns and charity galas. Federal agencies quickly became involved. The FBI traced financial records to 17 offshore accounts, unraveling a network of shell companies connected to Daniel's operation. The scale was staggering: over $12 million in profits across just 3 years. Immigration records revealed how Daniel had disguised his victims as patients to secure medical visas, a loophole few had imagined could be exploited this way. For Rachel, the days that followed blurred together in a haze of interviews, court hearings, and protective custody. Her children were taken in by relatives while she faced the legal consequences of Daniel's death. Prosecutors debated whether to charge her with manslaughter or treat her actions as self-defense. The court of public opinion was divided. Some saw her as a hero, a woman who had exposed an unimaginable crime. Others saw only a wife who had killed her husband. Through it all, Rachel remained haunted by the faces of the women she had seen in the clinic. Their hollow eyes, their shallow breaths, their silent pleas, these were the images that drove her forward, even as her own future hung in the balance. One moment stayed with her more than any other. It was the morning after the raid, when she was escorted to the hospital under police supervision. In one of the wards, she saw Isabella again. The girl was frail, her body ravaged by months of captivity. But when their eyes met, recognition flickered. Isabella reached out a trembling hand. Rachel took it, tears streaming down her face. No words were exchanged, but the gesture was enough. A bridge of humanity had survived the nightmare. The investigation widened in scope, leading to congressional hearings about the oversight of medical visa programs. Rachel's testimony, raw and unvarnished, brought lawmakers to silence. She spoke not as a victim or a criminal, but as a mother who had been forced to choose between silence and truth. "I could not let my children grow up believing that looking the other way is ever acceptable," she told them. The impact was immediate. Legislation was drafted to strengthen penalties for medical professionals who exploited their positions. Funding was allocated to support trafficking survivors. Rachel's name became synonymous with both tragedy and resilience. But at night, when the cameras were gone and the courtroom silent, Rachel was still just a woman who had lost everything she thought she knew. She often lay awake, listening to the echoes of Daniel's voice in her mind, his reassurances, his lies, his final threats. And she wondered whether her children would ever truly forgive her for the choice she had made. The story of Daniel Alvarez would dominate headlines for months, but for Rachel, the story was not about him. It was about the women who survived, the lives that were saved, and the lesson she carried forward, that sometimes, the only way to confront evil is to drag it into the light, no matter the cost. The trial of Rachel Alvarez began nearly a year after that December night, but for her, time had collapsed into a blur. The days between her husband's death and the courtroom felt like a single long shadow, stretching endlessly, marked only by the rhythm of hearings, interrogations, and nights spent staring at the ceiling of her small cell in county detention. The world already knew her story, or thought it did. To some, she was a courageous whistleblower who had risked everything to expose a monstrous criminal enterprise. To others, she was a murderer, a woman who had taken justice into her own hands. The courtroom would decide which truth would stand. On the first day of the trial, cameras swarmed the courthouse steps. News vans lined the streets. Commentators speculated about every detail: her appearance, her demeanor, her children, her motives. Rachel walked into the courthouse flanked by her attorneys, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wore a simple navy blouse and black slacks, her dark hair pulled back neatly. She looked less like the protagonist of a sensational trial and more like what she truly was, a mother, worn thin, fighting for her future. Inside, the prosecution painted a stark picture. They acknowledged Daniel's crimes but insisted his death had been unnecessary. They argued Rachel could have escaped, could have called the police without violence. They displayed photographs of the Alvarez kitchen, the overturned chairs, the blood on the floor. They described her as a woman pushed to the edge, but one who had crossed the line between victim and perpetrator. The defense countered with equal force. They highlighted the years of deception, the danger Rachel faced once she discovered the truth. They reminded the jury of the women found in the clinic's basement, of Isabella's testimony, of the international trafficking ring that Daniel had helped orchestrate. They framed Rachel's actions not as cold-blooded murder but as desperate self-defense in a moment of terror. When Rachel took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the witness box. She recounted everything: the late-night calls, the briefcase, the infiltration of the clinic, the confrontation in the kitchen. She did not embellish, did not dramatize. She told the story plainly, her words heavy with the weight of memory. The most powerful moment came when she spoke about her children. "I looked at my daughter," she said, her voice breaking, "and I thought of those women in the basement. I thought of their mothers, who might never know where their daughters had gone. And I realized I couldn't stay silent. Even if it cost me everything, I had to choose truth over fear." Isabella testified as well. Fragile but determined, she described the months she had spent in the clinic, the false promises Daniel had made, the slow erosion of her hope. She looked directly at Rachel as she spoke, her eyes filled with something between gratitude and sorrow. "She saved me," Isabella said simply. "Even if she didn't mean to, she saved all of us." The jury deliberated for 3 days. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on the community, the media, the survivors. When the verdict finally came, the tension in the room was unbearable. Rachel Alvarez was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, but the jury recommended leniency, citing extraordinary circumstances. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 3. The decision drew mixed reactions. Some argued the sentence was too light for a life taken. Others believed no prison term could ever balance the horrors Rachel had exposed. For Rachel herself, the sentence was both a punishment and a reprieve. She would lose years with her children, but she would not lose them forever. In the weeks that followed, Rachel began her time behind bars with a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, she no longer had to hide. The truth was out. The victims were free. Her children were safe with family. And though the walls of the prison closed around her, her conscience was no longer trapped in silence. Outside, the ripple effects continued. Laws were passed tightening oversight of medical practices and visa programs. Nonprofit organizations for trafficking survivors received unprecedented funding. Isabella became an advocate, her story inspiring change at a national level. In interviews, she always mentioned Rachel, not as a killer, but as the woman who had forced open the doors of a nightmare. Rachel herself remained quiet. She rarely gave interviews, rarely responded to the media frenzy. Instead, she focused on letters from her children, on therapy sessions that helped her process the trauma, on the small routines that made prison life bearable. When asked once by a counselor if she regretted what she had done, Rachel paused for a long time. Finally, she said, "I regret that my children lost their father. I regret that they will carry that pain forever. But I do not regret stopping him. Because if I hadn't, he would have destroyed so many more lives." Her words became a headline, then a soundbite, then a symbol. But for Rachel, they were not a performance. They were the only truth she had left. And so, the story of Daniel Alvarez ended not in silence, but in a strange kind of justice. The man who had built a life on lies and cruelty was gone. The women he had imprisoned were free. And the wife who had uncovered his crimes bore the scars of both love and betrayal, living proof of the impossible choices we sometimes face when evil hides in plain sight.